Here's a Harvard lecture,
Bob joined our faculty last year
Harvard School of Business. One of their first lectures on YouTube from over 10 years ago, and the title is Turmoil on the Street. That's in the thumbnail at the bottom.
Yale Law School, taught law for a period of time at Georgetown and New York University. Following that, he was in public service, worked in the General Counsel's Office of the Securities and Exchange Commission, and then subsequently was partner for Kaplan and Drysdale, where he led the banking and securities practice down there in Washington, D.C. Subsequent, Bob joined Fidelity Investments, where he rose to vice chairman and was president of Fidelity Management and Research Company, which is the actual investment advisor to the Fidelity family of funds. In addition to all of this, and in teaching in our required curriculum, Bob is also the chairman of MFS Investment Management, which is an asset management company with 200 billion assets under management.
It says Alamo.
5 billion invested worldwide.
I'll
Bob
show
has
you
been and remains today a very
what is like the Alamo
publisher
near here.
in this area, including along the way a textbook.
Here's
The
the
first
what's like the
textbook
Alamo.
comparing,
That's all.
banks, other financial institutions, and also has one of the leading textbooks on mutual funds. So we're delighted to have Bob today on this subject, and he's suggesting today he knows wherever he speaks, and we're very glad to have him. Thank you. Please welcome.
Well, my mother would have been proud of that introduction. Today, I thought we'd begin by using a few slides to make sure everybody is on the same page. Some of you may have gone to Rob Kaplan's session on background to the financial crisis. So I thought we'd go over a few slides just so that we all agree on how we got there, or generally how we got there. And then we'll look at a more Socratic method, though no cold calls, promise, as to what Washington has done, what they might do, what they should do, and whether any of these things are going to work. So starting with these slides, the first question is, I think you have to ask yourself is, how did a housing slump become a global financial crisis? And if we look at that question, then we need to start by saying, well, how do we look at this as a housing crisis? Is this a housing crisis that's so extraordinary that it just, by its very large quality, it produced a global financial crisis? We see that, yes, there's been a rise in housing prices, mainly since 2004. There's been a sharp drop in housing prices in the last year, probably in the 12 to 18% range. Why? The usual. Intermediaries had some new products and probably some old greed. Buyers, we have naive buyers, we have deceptive buyers, we have speculative buyers, and we have the normal result on the real economy, which is lower employment, revenues decline, etc. Now, the question is, why was it different this time? And the most important thing, I think, is that we had a secondary market. We had a secondary market for securities, so you had lots of the originators who were selling the mortgages into pools, and in these pools, they issued a variety of tranches, which constituted slices of interest and principal, all diced up in different ways, rated in different ways, and they were sold to global investors. Many of them got AAA ratings, and they were sold throughout the world. So I guess part of the reason we say here is we got a lot of global investors who held these securities, and they were in a variety of pools. The other thing that's critical to understand about the roots of this crisis is we essentially replicated the mismatch of the S&L crisis. For those of you who were around in the 80s, we had long mortgages, 15 and 30-year mortgages, matched against short-term deposits. Here, we didn't have to do it, but we did it. Most of these trusts that were set up, these off-balance sheet trusts, were holding 15, 30-year mortgages, various types of mortgages, but they were financed by 3-month and 6-month paper. So that meant that they had to be rolled over and rolled over. Why was it 3 months or 6 months? It was 3 months or 6 months because they had lower interest rates. So when you had the combination of mortgages from around the country in these relatively opaque pools, they were off balance sheet, they weren't in the banks and the sponsors, and you had this mismatch. As soon as you had a problem where people sensed that the quality of the underlying mortgages was going down and the default rates were going up, you had a number of things happen that were much broader than we've ever seen before. We had issues of these people. We had people throughout the world who held these things who started to get worried, and we had organizations that, like bank sponsors, that had different obligations, some of which weren't in the documents, some of which were, to deal with this short-term paper. So when you had paper that had to be rolled over every 3 months or 6 months, so somebody had to deal with that. And what we found out was that a lot of these people, Citigroup, for instance, took back on its balance sheet $40 billion of off-balance sheet securities. Why did it do that? Because it turned out it had an informal obligation to the off-balance sheet trust to continue liquidity, which means to continue buying the 3-month and the 6-month paper. So as a result, we had very quickly a short-term crisis. And the other thing is that this was overlaid with credit default swaps and other derivatives, meaning that there were insurance companies, banks, and other people who wrote insurance on whether or not mortgage pools would default or not. So we had many insurance companies, some of which had only done municipal securities, relatively safe securities, who wound up doing insurance in a much broader way. And these credit default swaps at the moment are about 55 trillion, so it's a lot of credit default swaps. So what are the results here? The results are 1 of 6 mortgages now exceeds the value of their home. We have lots of surprise bankruptcies of financial institutions, and we have uncertainty about the location of future losses. So this is what's causing a freezing up of the market for short-term debt. This is, again, an unusual thing, is that we start off with a debt problem, not a stock problem. And afterwards, we've now wound up with a short selling problem and a stock price problem. So if we put it all together, we say, what are the crucial factors here? Yes, we had a housing slump, but what was different is it was securitized across the world, and so we have lots of people who hold this across the world. Second of all, that it was done in a particularly opaque way. It wasn't on the balance sheets of the institutions that sponsored them. It wasn't on the Citicorp's balance sheet or Credit Suisse or UBS. And that these off-balance sheet entities themselves were opaque. So that once you had a problem, people had a great time figuring out where the losses are. Third of all, you had this mismatch of long and short securities, so you caused a liquidity problem because you had to go and buy this stuff every 3 months and 6 months. So think about it. What happened very quickly was that this became a short-term debt problem. Became a short-term debt problem is that no bank wanted to buy any other bank's paper, and no money market fund wanted to buy bank's paper. This is short-term, meaning 1 day, 7 days, 3 months. Why didn't they want to do it? Well, they had seen AIG go down. They had seen Lehman Brothers go down. they had seen Bear Stearns go down. So who will be the next? When my trader comes in and says to me, should I trade with Goldman Sachs today? I think to myself, well, if you're not going to trade with Goldman Sachs, who are you going to trade with? But that is the degree of fear. No one knows, because of this globalization of securities, because of the opaqueness of the information, combined with this liquidity problem, what we see is that we don't know where the losses are. How much are the losses? Most people have estimated the losses to be somewhere in the $600, $700, $800 billion losses from what are called subprime and Alt-A, which is another form of subprime mortgages. How much losses do we have reported? Something like 400, 450 billion. So we know that there are out there another 200, 300, 400 billion dollars of losses. We just don't know where they are. And every institution will tell you that they mark down their mortgages to the right level, and it's only a liquidity problem. Well, we know that half of them are right and half of them are wrong. And just to give you a sense is, Merrill Lynch's marks for its mortgage-backed securities, it's marked down them about 60%. Citigroup has marked them down by about 30%. Maybe they're slightly different, maybe they're the same, we don't know. So this is the environment that we're in. So you started with a freezing up of short-term loans. And that was sort of the immediate problem. Just think about this. If you're going to go and lend some money to somebody for 3 months, and they're willing to give you 4% above the treasury rate, essentially it's worth 1% to you in 3 months. So if you're lending them $100,000, you get $1,000 more. That's all. And you have the risk of losing it all if the institution goes under. So this is the sorts of dynamics why people wouldn't lend 3-month money. Most of the money that's being lent in the overnight market is being lent at 1 day and maybe at 7 days. Then the other event we had was that once this happened and people realized that any financial institution could be had, then we had what I viewed as